Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Capital Budget Subcommittee briefing, and we're going to be hearing capital budget analysis. Let me say happy Valentine's Day to everybody. Matthew Klein, it's always great to spend Valentine's Day with you. Yeah. But with that, I know you did put a lot of work into your briefing. But if you could, hit the high points, and if anyone has any questions, we can certainly ask it. And then we'll move on to some of the agencies. But with that, Mr. Klein, the floor is yours, sir.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, great. So I'm going to start with the first page, chart on budget change, just to give you some perspective of what's in the proposed fiscal 24 budget relative to what the budget you just passed last session and are continuing to manage now, the fiscal 23 budget. And if you look at the bottom, you'll see that the proposed budget is about 1.65 billion less than last year's budget. And before you get upset that the budget is shrinking, you need to know that the FY23 budget was a historic budget. I'll get into a little bit more about that in terms of its total size. So while it's 1.6 billion less than last year, it is still over $1 billion more than the prior year, and is higher than what was programmed in the CIP, and I'll get to that. So at the very top, at the bond authorization level. So the bond authorization level looks relatively consistent with last year's authorization level. The recommendation of the Spending Affordability Committee was to increase the authorization level, the new bond authorization level, to $1.205 billion, and then increase that at 4% annually thereafter. The administration has chosen to increase the authorization level for the 2023 session only to $1.205 billion, and not to increase it at an inflationary rate in the out years, but to hold that constant through the 5-year CIP, recognizing that the state has a large amount of general funds to support the capital program, which I'll touch on in a bit. So if you look at it compared to last year, it actually looks like it's going down. Last year's new authorization level was $1.155 billion, and then it was programmed to go down to $1.125 billion. But again, the administration it's consistent with SAC at $1.205 billion. The next line is bond premium, something I'll touch.
All right, we're working on it. You can continue.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the next line is in bond premiums, and you can see that bond premiums are at 0 for this year. And I'll touch on that. And that relates to the rising interest rates and how we apply bond premiums from our bond sales to the capital program. Next line, general funds. You can see this goes up substantially in 23, but down in 24. To give some perspective, though, the roughly 817 million of general funds in the budget is still greater than the previous 10 years prior to 2022. So it's only been since 2022 that we've seen an increase in general funds corresponding with the state's fiscal situation, which I'll touch on a little bit more. And then you'll notice that federal funds go down rather precipitously in 24. And this relates to the fact that the ARPA funds, which the budget has included in 2022 and 2023, are expiring. They are being replaced somewhat with IIJ funds, the Investment Jobs Act, Federal Jobs Act legislation, primarily in Department of Environment for drinking and water quality. So just, a quick summary of looking at 24 and comparing it only to 23, it looks like it goes down, but I'll touch more on that in a minute. So the next couple charts, again, just break down. Oh, come on. So this chart compares the 23 actual to the 24, but also and then embeds what was programmed for fiscal 24 in last year's CIP. So pretty much across the board, again, because the budget shrinks relative to last year by over 1.6 billion. You're going to see most of the funding categories actually decline relative to fiscal 23. But compared to what was programmed in the CIP, it is still a couple $100 million greater in total funding relative to what was programmed for this year. Again, general funds, a historic level in 2023. They were programmed to go down to roughly 445, but again, the budget provides $817 million. So again, still a very high number compared to prior to the recent years where the state's economy has improved greatly. Special funds actually go up. This is related to increased transfer tax revenues over attainment from 2022 that is applied to 2024, and increased spending in the drinking and water quality and other environmental programs predominantly are what are moving the special fund number. And again, I talked earlier about the federal funds. They go down relative to 23 because the ARPA money is expiring, but it's still slightly higher than what was planned for in last year's CIP, because last year's CIP did not program the IIJ funds in the CIP, which are now programmed in the current CIP. So you'll see over the next several years that federal funds are programmed to increase. This takes essentially the same information and then splices it up according to various categories that we like to apply when looking at the budget. So some significant areas you'll see that, in the Department of the Environment or environmental programs, the funding level again goes down relative to last year, but up relative to the CIP. Again, information or the federal IIJ funds are a significant factor there. The parks legislation passed by the General Assembly last session adds another $100+ million to this program compared to what was programmed last year in the environment, and some elimination of some one-time funding that was provided last session for Conowingo Dam dredging and best management practices in the Susquehanna River Basin, which were a one-time thing. Education, I'm focusing on the bigger portions of the capital budget. Education goes up relative to the CIP, but again, down relative to last year's budget. Last year, the General Assembly passed a historic level of school construction funding over $1.2 billion and provided additional supplemental funding as block grants to various locations, as well as additional supplementary program funding, the supplemental grant program in school construction, which was at $95 million last year, but is set back to the mandated level of $40 million. And higher education, relatively flat relative to the CIP. It goes down mostly because the program received significant boost in facility renewal funding, both direct funding to University System of Maryland, which would be distributed across the various institutions, but several other discrete projects that provided one-time funding to individual universities to help them with their level of deferred maintenance. I wanted to point your attention to local projects. You can see in 2023, over $725 million of local project funding compared to what is normally programmed in the CIP, roughly 6 to 10 million for things that are ongoing, miscellaneous contributions, for instance, to the Maryland Zoo. That's considered in that category. Now, the budget does provide $378 million for local initiatives, 100 million of which is in the dedicated purpose account, which remains unallocated. And that would be something that the General Assembly can then allocate to whatever purposes it chooses in that particular area. So that's where you get to 378, but it's still significantly below a historic level of funding for local projects, which we've seen over the last several years. The level of funding to local projects has continued to increase at a rather high pace, all the way into, over 725 million in 1 year. Next couple charts continue that discussion a bit. Looking at the 5-year CIP, comparing that to last year. For the 4 years in which the CIP overlaps, just to try to get a sense of, okay, I've shown you the magnitude of difference for fiscal 24, but how does that look when you compare that to the CIP for the 4 years in which they overlap? And the story is pretty much consistent with 24. Greater use of general funds relative to what was planned last year, even though last year's plan was still a rather historic level of programmed general funds in the out years of the CIP. This year's CIP adds even more to that level of funding, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. And special funds, they go up. Again, a big portion of this are funding in the Maryland Department of the Environment and the transfer tax revenues that would be collected. Compared to the CIP of last year, you're looking at almost 2 billion more over the next 4 years compared to what was programmed last year. So while the budget goes down relative to last year, it is up relative to what was programmed in last year's CIP for the next 4 years in which they overlap. And this, again, just takes that down to the particular categories of spending that we block this in. And you can see, again, local projects, significant boost. That's almost all programmed in fiscal 2024. The out years do not program much in the way of local funds, which is pretty consistent. Normally, we're not programming miscellaneous projects in the CIP other than annual ongoing grants to things like the zoo. In housing and community development, that goes up. Couple pieces here. One, the biggest piece is the continuation of Project Core, which was set to expire with the 2023 budget, and the CIP programs that to continue through all 5 years of the CIP. Education, again, goes up and environment goes up, consistent with what you're seeing in 24. A big portion of that increase is again in 2024 for both of those, but the inclusion of the IIJ funding in the CIP, which was not programmed last year, is a big component in moving the environment number. And before I get into some of the more policy related things, I wanted to put this chart in because this is where I'm trying to get to the magnitude of the budget. You can see 24 down relative to 23, but still up slightly to 2022, which at the time was a historic level of funding. The budget had not exceeded $2 billion ever, the capital program ever, excluding the transportation program, of course, prior to 2022. So you can see over the last several years and continuing into FY24, historic levels of funding overall. Next few sections deal with affordability. Again, because the state's economy has improved dramatically, really beginning in March of 2021, during the 2021 session, the revenues were written up. And since that time, the revenues continue to be strong. And what that's done is that has improved our affordability ratios. And what I've chosen here is the debt service to revenue affordability ratio. And the standard is to keep that at below 8%. And prior to the increase in revenues beginning again in March of 2021, the state was hovering in the low to mid 7%. In fact, in prior years, the Great Recession, the state had to reduce its GO bond authorization levels in order to stay within the 8% limit. But you can see here there's plenty of capacity and we're well within the affordability ratios. And this is one of the reasons why the budget includes a significant amount of general funds, because the state has general funds now. And rather than using debt capacity while the state has a budget surplus, the decision was to try to keep the bond authorization levels relatively consistent with what was programmed, despite a small increase that SAC had recommended, but to use the state's general funds to support the capital program. The next chart gets into that a bit to just give you some perspective. So since 2020, the bond authorization levels remain relatively flat, small growth. The growth you see in 2021 and 2022, it relates to the bond premiums because the state had authorized a significant amount of bond premiums in both the 2021 and 2022 sessions. 136 and 222 million respectively in both of those years. And we count those essentially as bond proceeds. And so it's counted in that. That's why you see a jump in 21 and 22. And then relatively remaining flat in the out years is the authorization level remains at $1,205,000,000. But you could see beginning in 2022, fiscal 2022, a large increase in general funds. Prior to that, most of the general funds you see in 2020 and 2021 are actually dedicated to transportation projects, the WMATA grants specifically, which I'll touch on. And then in 2023, the roughly $2.3 billion of general funds, to the point where it exceeded almost twofold the level of GEO bond funds applied to the capital program. And again, a high level in 24 and still a relatively high level program through the CIP relative to the historic levels. With good news, there's always some hard news, which is while the economy has improved and revenues improved, so have interest rates on the bonds that we issue. And I'm going to thank Patrick Frank for helping me with this section. He is our expert in our debt analysis. So he did help me with some of this, and you may see some of this in his analysis as well. But the interest rates for the bonds that we issue are going up. And in fact, the bond buyer index has moved. The state municipal bonds have increased from below 3% to over 4%. And what that means is that gets back to the bond premiums. There's an inverse relationship between the interest rate and the bond premiums that we collect. When the interest rates were low, we were collecting a large amount of bond premiums. As I'd said earlier, both 21 and 22, a large amount. And there was 680 million going back to 2019 through 2023, if you count the 260 million that was authorized in bond premiums last year. However, with the rising interest rates, the expectation of bond premiums has changed dramatically to the point where the 260 million that was authorized in premiums last session are not expected to materialize, which is why we've programmed roughly 40 million in there now. And as a result, the budget includes a $219 million general fund deficiency. So the projects and the programs supported in the capital program with bond premiums will not be interrupted and will have a source of funding. And because of that, the CIP does not program any bond premiums in the out years. While there may still be some bond premiums collected in the March bond sale, that remains to be seen, and whether they'll be applied to that capital program also remains to be seen. But the expectations for bond premium collections should be tempered relative to what we've seen the last few years as another source of funding to support the capital program. And just to double down on that concept, rising interest rates also affect programs and projects that the state has authorized, where there's a set level of debt service that is fixed on which will then dictate the level of bonds, the amount of bonds you're going to be able to issue. And the chart you see here is pulling out probably the biggest area in which that's going to have an impact, and it's in the Built to Learn program. When the program was initiated, there were estimates that it would produce roughly $2 billion of proceeds for the program. As the interest rates have gone up, the expectations of that are beginning to shrink. And this chart just gives you some perspective, the blue being what's already been issued, the red being the remaining amount that would be issued up against that cap on the amount of debt debt service that is fixed in the budget. And with each 0.5% increase in the expectation of the bond issuance, the amount of proceeds that would be collected from those issuances goes down, and potentially reduce the amount that was anticipated for Built to Learn. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't remind you, though, that the 2 million level for Built to Learn was never a promised amount of funding. That was just an amount that was anticipated that could be collected when running scenarios a couple of years ago when that legislation was passed. But of course, the interest rates have changed, and the expectations on what that would produce have changed likewise. And there's some information on a couple other projects as examples of fixed interest rates and the impacts that that's having on those programs. For the Pimlico and Laurel Park, the expectation that it would produce 375 million of proceeds. It's going to produce, right now, the expectation would be significantly less. And the Hagerstown project also is impacted by lower or higher interest rates and lower proceeds from the sales. And again, not to be a downer, but while the economy's improved, that's also driven up the cost of construction. This chart shows the Baltimore region's annual escalation rate in construction. And it went from 9.6%, which was still relatively high on a year-over-year basis, all the way up to over 20% in 2022. And that averages out to about 14% on an average annual basis over the last 3 years. And you're going to hear from the analysts in your budget hearings where most projects that you're looking at are going to have a cost increase relative to what we were anticipating in the CIP. Now, the state goes through a rather robust cost estimating process when evaluating projects and putting them in the CIP, but ultimately the market's going to decide what a project's going to cost when you take those contracts to the street, so to speak, and receive bids on those. And one of the observations here is that the escalation rates that have been established in the cost estimating process just haven't kept pace with what's actually happening in the market. Now, part of that is, and when I'm talking to DBM about this scenario, and some of this makes sense, which is they want to be able to hold the design teams to, the budget that's been established, right? And if we established, a 20%, for instance, escalation rate for calendar 2022, that might not provide the proper incentive for the design teams to design the projects to the original budget. I mean, ultimately, we're going to need to pay what's going to be required to service the contract without impeding the scope of a project. But still, the rates have been set relatively low. And while the rate was increased for 2022 from 5 to 9%, the out years are still reflected at 5%. So projects in the CIP that will be, moved forward and go to bid in the next couple of years may at this point, when you're looking at them in the CIP, be underfunded relative to what's been estimated in the CIP. The next chart just gives you the indices, again, in the Baltimore region. I guess the good news is that for the last couple months, it's actually started to trend down a little bit. Although I'd be cautious because it went down precipitously for a few months during the pandemic and then increased again. So, we'll continue to track this to see, where that stands. But the point is that the cost of construction on the projects that you're going to be reviewing throughout session, you're going to see a lot of projects with higher cost estimates and higher funding requests. The next few sections just get into some of the larger segments of the budget. I had mentioned earlier that school construction funding, and this gives you some perspective. This shows at the top the impact of Built to Learn, which is how we get to the over 1.2 billion in fiscal 2023 and the roughly 1.1 billion in fiscal 2024. But even this shows growth in the regular program, which was pretty much held steady at roughly 400 million in 2020 and 2021. And that was the established goal. I believe the established goal now outside of Built to Learn is 450 million, which the proposed budget, it provides more than that. But you can see the last couple of years that even outside of Built to Learn, there's been an emphasis in escalating and increasing the level of funding for school construction. A big component of that was a block grant. Roughly 267 million of a block grant in last year's budget, which was added by the General Assembly as a trying to understand why that, for instance, the 2023 number is so high, but still the 2024 number is still well in excess of the established goal. Next chart just deals with higher education funding. It lists all the various components, the private all the way down through the University System of Maryland, and what was budgeted in 23 and what was programmed for 24 and what's budgeted for 24. And then overall, again, just like everywhere else, you're seeing a decline relative to 23, but an increase relative to what was planned. The number in 23 was also inflated by the inclusion of one-time facility renewal funds, both in system and in various institutions. And because the legislature's had the ability to add to the capital budget prior to its new powers to adding to the operating budget, higher ed is one of the areas in which the General Assembly often uses those powers to increase funding for various higher education facilities particularly at USM institutions, but also at the other, Morgan, St. Mary's, and the like. Now, I had mentioned facility renewal. One of the things I wanted to point out for facility renewal for system, we'll start with that, is that the funding level that's proposed in the plan goes down relative to what was proposed last year, even after a bump last year, which is consistent with what SAC wanted. The Spending Affordability Committee prior to the 2022 session had put an emphasis on facility renewal at both higher ed in both higher ed and in Department of General Services. And we saw that with some one-time funding in 2023, but that does not carry forward in 2024, nor does it carry forward through the 4 years in which the CIP overlap. In fact, the total funding dedicated to facility renewal in higher ed, specifically the university system office administered program, goes down by 75 million over the next 4 years. And another aspect to this too is it also relies on $75 million of plant funds, which is something that we've discussed the last few years, is questioning whether or not those plant funds will actually materialize in the budget. So a decline overall in that. But I did want to point out a couple other things, though, with respect to facility renewal and maintenance at higher ed institutions. And this just gives you what USM is spending from 2020 all the way through the 24 allowance. A couple things to point out here. The purple and then the shaded purple. The purple is what the institutions are putting in themselves in their operating budget. And one of the things you'll notice is that each year they'll set a level of spending and then they actually exceed that level. And that's where the dashed purple lines come from. And that gives you what your total amount that system is putting in operationally to facility renewal. And the other piece of this is the top, the red section. This is trying to give some credence to the fact that the CIP itself, when we're funding projects and renovations or replacing projects, that is also reducing the facility renewal backlog, as many projects in buildings that will ultimately be replaced are on the backlog, but then will be removed from the backlog as we fund projects through the CIP. So we really address the backlog in two ways: one, through direct funding for facility renewal, and two, when we fund new projects for either renovations or projects that will replace aging facilities that will come down. Next chart just gives you a perspective of where the roughly $2.6 billion backlog in University System of Maryland facility renewal backlog is across institutions. It also measures this according to Facility Condition Index, which is a new policy of system, which we're happy about. We believe that measuring these things according to a Facility Condition Index is the way to go. One of the things I wanted to point out is this University of Maryland College Park. You can see, if you look at their entire amount of reported building renovations and deferred maintenance, or just for building renovations, excuse me, the Facility Condition Index is 45%. That's not good. High is not good, low is good, okay? But relative to what they've included on their backlog for facility renewal, it goes down to 16.3%. The focus is really on both. As new buildings are brought on, the FCI based on total renovation should go down. And as we're putting more into facility renewal, the FCI for the deferred maintenance should also go down. Since we're talking about facility renewal, the next section just gives some perspective on what's happening for the DGS managed facility renewal program. Again, this was an emphasis of the Spending Affordability Committee last year and this year to try to use the state's budget surplus to its advantage in applying funds for facility renewal. And last year's budget included 110 million in DGS for facility renewal, 75 million of which was originally put and is in the dedicated purpose account and has not been released at this point because it's going to take time for DGS to actually get to that level of spending. Now, on the positive side, the backlog has been reduced relative to 2022 slightly. And also the high risk of failure in litigation and the premature deterioration, which are the two categories that you really don't want to see a backlog in if you can, those are relatively low and almost non-existent. So while the backlog is relatively large, the items that are on the list are not in the high risk category. Now, DGS has managed to improve their encumbrance level. It's something we've talked about for quite some time, which is to try to get the DGS management of their facility renewal program to a point where they can encumber, upwards of 40 million, which is what it's going to take to be able to actually reduce the backlog. Because even if you're getting encumbrances of 40 million, new projects are being added to the list each year. So the goal really is to try to spend more than you're adding to the list. And 40 million is roughly that number that would get you to the point where you'll be able to manage and whittle away that backlog and at least over, not an overly long period. It'll still take time. And you'll always have a backlog at some point because you're always going to be adding new projects to the list.
Matt, you're doing a great job. If you can just
I'm almost done.
Yep.
Next section deals with transportation. I think the take here is that transportation has increasingly been taking up a portion of the state's capital program outside of the CTP. The two biggest pieces have been the WMATA grants and the inclusion of the Howard Street Tunnel project. But also, if you take a look at what was authorized in the budget last year, there are increasingly a number of local projects which would really be best served to be funded out of the transportation program. And that's also adding to the pressures on the rest of the capital program when we have a source of funding for transportation. The orange that you see in 2024 reflects the fact that the budget includes an earmark of 500 million in the revenue stabilization count for transportation projects. The next chart just gives you perspective on how the WMATA grants have been funded. I don't think I need to spend too much time on that. Next section deals with the environment. I think the take here is the transfer tax. And I've included both the December 2020 through the December 2022 estimate. So you can see a couple trends here. While relative to the December 2021 estimate, the new estimate for 2022 is down, okay, through all years of the CIP. So there'll be less transfer tax funds budgeted in the CIP over the next several years. It's still higher than what was projected in December of 2020. So really, we just kind of had a one-year blip in the estimate for that. And we're returning more to a December 2020 estimate, and it is still higher than that. And one of the things you're going to see in the budget is the way in which we fund the transfer taxes. The final number for 2022 is actually 122 million over the December 20 estimate. That gets added to fiscal 2024. So while the revenue estimate is actually down in the budget relative to last year, the overattainment of 122 million actually makes for more funding, more transfer tax funding available to the programs. However, the write down that we're seeing this year portends a underattainment that would then be applied next year. I'm going to skip this one. I think that's just gives you a perspective on where the funding is going to the individual programs. Last, in the environment, this is the expectation for what the state should be receiving from the IIJ funding. And again, most of this is going to come through MDE. This only deals with what's in MDE. We are anticipating that broadband would be supported by roughly another 100 million out of IIJA. But this looks just exclusively at what's happening in the Department of the Environment. And again, none of this was programmed in last year's CIP. These funds did start to get to the state in fiscal 2022. Okay. In NDE, roughly 155 million was provided from IIJA in 2020 in the 2023 budget. So it's not brand new funding, and it is. This schedule is according to the federal schedule that the state's going to receive for the various programs that NDE operates. And again, most of this is in drinking water and water quality loan, enhancing both of those established programs, but there are also three new programs in here. The Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund addressing emerging contaminants, the drinking water addressing emerging contaminants, and finally, the assistance for small and disadvantaged communities, and the biggest piece, the lead service line replacement. Okay, so we're anticipating roughly 880 million of federal funds through IIJA just for MDE. And the last section that I'm going to talk about, because I'm certainly not going to talk about the appendices because I feel the hook coming, gives them some perspective on housing. Again, trying to focus on the bigger sections of the budget. And the big story here is, yes, the level of funding relative to 2023 is down. A big component of the federal ARPA money was flowing through DHCD predominantly for the broadband network, and some to rental housing. And so that's why you're seeing a change in the budget, but it is still higher than what was programmed last year overall. With that, I'll take questions if there are any. Otherwise, I will concede to my colleagues.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew. And I know you put a lot of work into this and we are very appreciative. Any questions for Matthew? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much. Committee, we will now turn our attention to the analysis. And I think what I might do is just go a little bit out of order. I want to start with the Department of Information Technology. So if we can start with Mr. Frank. And you can begin whenever you get settled.
It says that the host has disabled my screen sharing.
Budget cuts.
Oh, I know, I need to make my comments.
We got you.
There you go.
Good. Right. Okay. The Department of Information Technology. This is the Public Safety Communication System, or the Maryland First System. It has a number of different names. Basically what it is, it's a first responder radio system that is statewide. As you can see, almost $400 million has been spent on this system over the last 2 decades. At this point, it's almost done. And the recommendation is to concur with the analysis. I'll go right into the project now. This map shows all the different phases of it. There are a total of 5 phases. The first one was for the Transportation Authority only, and then it was done regionally. What you'll notice is it used to be like 1 or 2 years between phases being completed, but from 2019 or 2019 to 23, it was 4 years for the last phase to get done. One reason for that is the technology that it was using, the Ethernet technology, was being implemented newly. There was an older T1 technology that was previously used. The advantage of the Ethernet technology is like, I think it's by the order of hundreds of thousands of more data is allowed to go through that. And so there's an advantage to that, but it took a while to get the figure for the vendor to figure that out. And so there were delays and at one point it was almost done. Testing didn't work out and they had to redesign it. And so that last part took a little bit longer because of the new technology, but I'm hearing that it should be done in April and the testing is going as it should be. I'll skip now. I already mentioned the Ethernet onto the radio sites. What they're finding now with this system is that the models were good, but reality sometimes has some dead spots and things that drop calls and things like that. And so what they're doing is they're finding the places that need additional radio tower. The policy basically is what's most urgent and what's most what's most urgent and least expensive, and to work your way down from there. There'll probably be some new towers in the new the Southern Maryland, the nation's capital as well, but it's too early because it hasn't been implemented yet. So the list here. The CIP did increase for this project. What happened is a year ago, you see the line is the towers were in this project. And that's been part of the plan. Now the department has notified us, and this is what was added was not a surprise. There are some other additional areas in which they think they would need to make some improvements. One is fiber optics. That's what's called backhaul. Basically, the way to understand backhaul is there's the tower and then the network that things are on, and what connects those two is the backhaul. And so a lot of that's not fiber optic, and they're upgrading it. And so that's part of the additional new cost. They're also what they call geo-redundant sites. Well, there's 22 different cells. They have one center cell, and what they do is they want to increase that. So there's, in case something goes out, that they have some redundancy there. And finally, in building is a problem in some places. And so they'll be installing some amplifiers in public buildings. And once again, it's on a priority basis. And let's see, I think two last points to make. One is maintenance is really important. We just heard about the other maintenance backlogs. Let's hope that this is a brand new system now and it's nice and shiny, but let's hope that it's maintained properly so that in 20 years we're not talking about all the costs we need to get it back up to where it was. And finally, operating, they have basically 4 people in this agency that are doing a 24/7. The contractors do the work, but there's 4 people that are monitoring the contractors. With the last one coming on, I'm not, if there may well be a reevaluation of staff and some additional staff may be needed in the future. It's too early to tell at this point. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks and take questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frank, for that great analysis. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Call up Acting Secretary Savage. Welcome. Come on up. So, Madam Secretary, we have your wonderful written testimony. So thank you. And, if you just want to hit the highlights, and we appreciate you being here, Madam Secretary. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, Chairman and members of the committee. Good to see many of you again. I'm Katie Savage, Acting Secretary of the Maryland Department of Information Technology. I'm joined today by Norm Farley, who is our Chief of Public Safety Communications. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony to the committee. And I do want to thank Mr. Frank, our DLS analyst, for his continued efforts and support. So the DO-IT has one capital project to review, as mentioned, which is the Maryland First statewide public safety communication system. Each month, the Maryland First system averages over 2.5 million push-to-talks from radio user transmissions. Additionally, the system now supports over 83,000 members of the Maryland public safety community, over 100 different state agencies, county, federal, and neighboring state jurisdictions. All Maryland counties, Baltimore City, Annapolis, and Ocean City are either primary or interoperable users of the system. Maryland First continues to grow and expand its adoption within the public safety community, meeting the goal of interoperable, mission-critical voice communications throughout the state. In the short time that I have been Secretary at DO-IT, I have been very impressed by the professionalism and the scale at which Maryland First project has performed. And I look forward to working with Norm and his team to expand on the exciting and essential work they've done so far. So with that, I will pause and answer any questions, but turn it over to Norm.
Sure, if you have anything else to add, please.
I agree with everything
All
you
right.
said.
Well, I think that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Madam Acting Secretary. It was so poignant that there's no questions. So thank you.
Okay.
Have a great
You as well.
evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee will now turn our attention to Historic St. Mary's Commission. Ms. Smith, please start whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. We've loaded. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Morgan Smith. I'm going to quickly walk through the state-owned projects at Historic St. Mary City Commission. There are 5. The first 2 you've seen, they were here last year. The first one is site improvements across Historic St. Mary City Commission. And that starts on page 3. The site improvements include addressing problems that are relating to aging infrastructure across Historic St. Mary's City Commission. And there's $1 million budgeted both this year and then in the out years for these projects. DLS is asking that the adoption of committee narrative is asking for the adoption of committee narrative to require Historic St. Mary City to submit an annual report that outlines the use of funds under the site improvement project. We have had difficulty understanding which site improvement projects are happening per year. And so we're requesting just status updates on each of these projects. The next project that you'll see is the Leonard Calvert House. This is also an ongoing project that had funding in prior years. In this year, there are $683,000 in general obligation bonds to begin archaeological work. This is on site prior to the design for the exhibit, which is scheduled in fiscal 2028. So this is preemptive money for archaeological work. And then there are 3 projects that were not included in past CIPs. The first one is the Education Center and Artisan Center renovation and systems upgrade. You've probably seen this project or the name of this project over the last couple of fiscal years, but this project will renovate the current visitor center and it will upgrade adjacent storage facilities and provide a meaningful educational experience for visitors and families. I believe also that St. Mary's College of Maryland Museum Studies students will be able to use this space for educational purposes. On the next page, you will see a project that is it begins in 2027. This is the collection, storage, and maintenance facility project. It'll be a 2-floor facility that supports the research and collections and facilities maintenance departments. And it will house additional storage for materials that have come from archaeological research, as well as staff offices, restrooms, a break room, et cetera. And like I said, the funding has been added for this purpose in fiscal 2027, and that is for design of this facility. And the last item that I'll just point out is the chapel interpretive exhibit. This will establish an interpretive exhibit that is adjacent to the brick chapel of 1667, and it will enable the museum to provide an educational experience and display artifacts as it relates to the religious tolerance of Maryland back when Maryland was first established in the 17th century. And money for that begins in 2028. And with that, our recommendation is to approve the GO bond for Leonard Calvert and site improvements, in addition to the recommendation for the submitting of the annual report. And with that, I will take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Smith, for that thoughtful analysis. Thank you very much.
No
See
problem.
any questions? We'll now call up the Regina Faden, Executive Director, and her team with Historic St. Mary's Commission. Feel free to begin whenever you get settled, and we do have your response if you just want to hit the high notes, and thank you very much.
Yes, good afternoon to everybody. I will go quick. My name is Tim Healy. I've been the
excuse me, chairman of the commission since July. A lot of good things happened last year. We got the dove over from St. Michael's, which you all supported. We have continued digging on the fort. Every week or so, the archaeologists find something new that's going to really expand what we show. We've broken ground the interpretive center, and but this is all about next time, not last time. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Fodden to give you our pitch.
Okay, so thank you very much. My name is Regina Fodden. I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of Historic St. Mary City Commission. With me, as you know, is our chair, and then my colleagues, Joe Kangas, Director of Facilities and Grounds, and Doug Hunter, Director of Finance. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee and staff, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. We're grateful for Morgan's keen analysis, and you do, as you said, we have our analysis, our response, we won't go over that. But just a little bit about the capital program. In 2021, the commission approved a new master plan that lays out a vision for historic St. Mary City to become a premier historical site like Jamestown and Colonial Williamsburg as we prepare for the commemoration of our state's founding in 2034. We're very grateful for the support of our governor and his administration, the Maryland General Assembly, in particular, our local legislators, Senator Jack Bailey and Delegate Brian Crosby, whose unflagging enthusiasm will help us realize this vision. We're grateful for the support and hard work put forth on the behalf of our colleagues at DBM to identify the site improvement projects and others that will improve the visitor experience, and for our colleagues at DGS who lend their expertise and professionalism to manage these projects. A little bit about St. Mary City, to be brief. To date, we have identified over 300 archaeological sites, which have yielded evidence of people living along the shores of the St. Mary's River as long as 10,000 years ago. As our chair mentioned, the fort, the 1634 fort, has revealed artifacts about the story of Maryland's founding. Over the coming years in the future, our research will reveal as yet unknown stories about the interaction among people from indigenous communities from Africa and Europeans who came to colonize the site during the 17th century, when concepts of race, freedom, and civil rights were fluid, yet to be defined by culture and law. The newly constructed tall ship, the Maryland Dove, will be sailing to ports of call around the Chesapeake Bay in this year to educate and delight those who might not otherwise be able to experience boarding the ship. The construction of the new visitor center, the single largest capital project in the history of the commission, has broken ground, and we look forward to welcoming you to the grand opening in 2024. And we greatly appreciate our partners at St. Mary's College who are acting as managers on this very important project. As you can see, there are very exciting times at St. Mary's City. We thank you for your interest and support. We concur with the recommendation and are available for any questions.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Dr. Fodden? Okay, I don't see any. Thank you very much.
Thank
Appreciate
you very
it.
much.
Committee will now turn our attention to the Maryland State Library Association. We'll start with Ms. Laura Hyde. Ms. Hyde, you can begin anytime you're ready. Thank you.
Okay, again, I am Laura Hyde, and I am the analyst for the Maryland State Library Agency. We're starting on page 1 with the CIP. And so you can see in fiscal 24, the budget is introduced as an additional $4.1 million to the state library budget. And the State Library Agency has a mandated amount under Chapter 27 of $7.5 million. You'll turn your attention to page 2. Under updates, the library program in fiscal 22 operating budget had $2.6 million in federal stimulus funds for broadband. Of that amount, $648,000 was spent on infrastructure improvements, and DLS recommends that MSLA comment on the need for additional capital investment to expand broadband access to county libraries. If you'll turn your attention to page 3, this is Exhibit 1. This is a list of the capital grant programs projects list. You can see that there are there's 7.5 million in the base budget, and then there's an additional 4.1 million in additional funding. So new project under this budget, the Glen Burnie Library gets 200,000 in base funding. Ruth Enlow Library in Garrett gets 513,000 in base funding, and Worcester County also gets 2.2 million in base funding. Continuing projects include the Catonsville Library, which gets 2.4 million in supplemental funding. The new Twin Beaches Library in Calvert gets 854,000 in supplemental funding. Caroline Denton Library gets 467,000 in base funding. Frederick gets 563,000 in supplemental funding, and Hartford gets 3.6 million in base funding. Prince George's Baden Library gets 519,000 in supplemental funding, and St. Michael's Library renovation gets 240,000 in base funding. That is a total of the 11.5 million, and then there's 12.5 million expected in the next year. And then I'm going to have you just turn to let me see, 16, so the last page. Just wanted to show you that the total public library capital grant allocation, this is over the last, since fiscal 2008. And since fiscal 19, though, the total requests for capital funds have averaged approximately $9.6 million per year, with a range of 7.6 million to 11.2 million. This exhibit shows you that 96.3 million in actual and allocated funds for library capital projects since 2008. And since that time, Hartford County's received the largest share with 7.5 million. And this year, for the first time, Garrett County receives funds 513,000. We recommend approving these projects, and this ends my presentation. I stand for questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hyde. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Now call up Ms. Padilla, and I do recognize that you have 13 people signed up, all favorable written testimony, so acknowledged. Please start whenever you wish.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Irene Padilla, Maryland State Librarian, and with me today is Donna Liberto, our Chief Financial Officer. And we also have Tamar Sarnoff, who's head of our public libraries section. We're here in support of the Maryland State Library Agency's capital budget, which includes not only the mandated amount of $7.5 million, but a supplemental funding of $4,050,000. And we are so appreciative of that. On behalf of the entire Maryland library community, I want to thank you for your ongoing commitment to this program. Since its implementation in fiscal year 2008, your mandate to provide $5 million and now $7.5 million annually has helped 23 of the state's 24 library systems improve one or more of their library buildings. This year, for the first time in the history of the program, we're recommending a project in Garrett County, and we're so excited about that. And that will bring our total to 24. Additionally, your investment has been matched by local funds, and that was one of the main intents of this program when it was established. We have so far received $370 million in matching funds for this project, more than 4 times the amount of the state's investment. You have a written testimony, and Laura Hyde's very thorough analysis provides an excellent description of the program. So I won't go into detail about the projected projects we have upcoming and the 19 beautiful new libraries that have opened because of the program. I want to express our gratitude for your recognition of the need to increase the funding from $5 million to $7.5 million. That makes a huge difference in what we're able to do. And we are, as the analyst points out, since fiscal 2020, total requests for library capital funds have averaged $9.3 million per year, with an average shortfall of $2.3 million from the allowance. So the governor's budget, as introduced, has a total of the $12.5 million in future spending for the projects funded in 2024. And this amount exceeds the mandated grant allowance by $5 million. So in addition to the current projects, the state library is aware that at least 3 new construction projects and a growing number of major renovation and expansion projects that will request funding in 2025. The only way the agency can accommodate these requests is through additional supplemental funding for the program, another increase in the mandate, or through the enactment of current pending legislation. Senate Bill 501, entitled Aging Infrastructure Capital Improvement Grant Program, would authorize an additional $40 million annually over the next 6 years for library capital projects. above the existing library capital grant program. The only alternative we see right now is to stall the completion of current projects and wait to fund any new projects. With your ongoing support, Maryland libraries will remain responsive to their community's needs, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Padilla, for that very concise testimony. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Committee will now turn our attention to Baltimore City Community College. Mr. Quist, start whenever you're ready. Good to see you.
Thank you. I'm getting a message about not being able to share screens.
Don't worry, it's not a sign.
Okay.
We'll get there. Yeah, we're good. It's all good.
There it is. All right. Thank you, members of the subcommittee. This is the capital budget for the Baltimore City Community College. As you can see on the screen, the FY24 budget includes funding for 2 projects, the Learning Commons renovation and addition project and the deferred maintenance project. There are also 2 other projects in the CIP scheduled for future years, the nursing building renovation and addition and the facilities building. The other thing I point out on page 2 of the analysis under the updates section regarding the Bard building site redevelopment in Baltimore, the FY22 operating budget included approximately 7.4 million in funding to support the demolition of this building, which has been vacant for several years. And DGS has reported it has procured a design contract and will be moving forward with a construction contract with demolition to include begin later in the calendar year. The discussion of scroll. Just 1 second. Okay. Discussion of the Learning Commons project begins on page 4 of the analysis. There is 1.1 million in GEO bond funding to fund the design, completion of the design phase for that project, which will renovate the existing Bard building on the college's main campus, and will also build an addition to create a new learning commons facility. Renovations will replace outdated building systems and also reconfigure the space to reconfigure the layout for both study space and other programming. The design for this project is scheduled to begin in April of this year, with construction beginning in late 2024. The second project, the deferred maintenance project, the discussion begins on page number 6. The capital budget includes a total of $8 million for this program, which includes both $4 million in general obligation bond funding and $4 million in PAYGO special funding from the Fiscal Responsibility Fund. This is the 3rd year of state funding for deferred maintenance at BCCC, which brings the total state support to 22.5 million over the past 3 years, including the funds in the budget for FY24. The CIP also programs 4 million annually in future years through fiscal 2028. The deferred maintenance project in the capital budget provides funding for BCCC's extensive deferred maintenance backlog. According to a study that was conducted by the Maryland Higher Education Commission, BCCC has the largest percentage of gross square footage constructed before 1971 of any Maryland community college at 15%, and most of the campus was originally built in the 1960s. Turning to exhibit number 1 on the next page, this is showing a breakdown of the categories for deferred maintenance projects that were either planned or funded through the previous allocation in the prior 2 years. As you can see, there's a wide variety of different projects. And then exhibit number 2 on the next page is showing a similar breakdown for the funding for fiscal 2024 and future years for that priority. Lastly, DLS is going to concur with the recommendations for both projects for the GEO bond funds and the PAYGO special funds, and I will conclude there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Quist, for that analysis. Senator Rosepep.
Thank you. I'm new to the subcommittee, so I plead ignorance. The Bard building site redevelopment, I'm reading what's there, but give me kind of the big picture here. What was in the building? Why nothing in the building? What are you going to do with the land?
Yes, so the Bard building is downtown Baltimore. It's been vacant for a number of years now, and there was also a fire that took place there in about 2020. So I don't believe there's been actual programming occurring there for a number of years.
Where is it exactly?
It is located downtown. I think it's on about Lombard Street, kind of downtown Baltimore City.
It's in Baltimore City. Sorry? Pardon me?
Lombard and Gay.
Gotcha. And so what was there before it became empty?
So,
Go ahead. Mr. Quist, I don't know if some of this should be directed to.
Maybe directly to the school.
Sure.
That'd be fine. Yeah.
yeah, it was part of the college, but I think they could, I'm not exactly sure
That's fine.
what it was.
I'll ask
beforehand,
them.
but
That's
sure.
fine. Thank you.
Okay.
No, you're good. You're good. Any other questions for Mr. Quist? Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
We'll now turn to the school. If we can have the president, Deborah McCurdy, come up and team. Welcome. Good to see you again. And I think you heard Vice Chair Rosepep's question, so maybe you can address that later on. But we have your written testimony, so thank you very much. And just want to hit the highlights. But we're really happy to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, and certainly appreciate being here. Good afternoon, Chairman Zucker, Vice Chairman McCray, members of the committee as well. For the record, I'm Deborah McCurdy, President of Baltimore City Community College. I'm joined by Vice President Michael Thomas, who's over workforce and also oversees facilities, as well as our Assistant Vice President for facilities as well, Kate Zerlich. I'm very pleased to be here. We'll thank our DLS analyst, Sam Quist, along with Matthew Klein for their support as well. And we're very pleased that you've allowed us to be here with this brief testimony about the capital budget and the 8 million in deferred maintenance and the 1.11 to continue with the design of the Learning Commons as well. This certainly demonstrates Maryland's commitment to Baltimore City Community College and what we do in the city and what we provide for our students. And you've already heard that the college has the largest percentage of gross square feet constructed before 71 of all of the other two-year institutions in the state. When you couple everything at BCCC, the age of the facilities, the lack of routine funding for what transpires at the institution, it is a perfect storm for all of the maintenance repairs and projects and all of the failure in the building systems. But I can only assure you that the funding that we've received through your support over the last few years has made a tremendous difference in the delivery of service for our students as well. We continue to work with DGS very closely to further reduce the deferred maintenance backlog that we've had for some years. And thanks to the study coming out of the state, that has helped to push forward a lot of the deferred maintenance and the changes that need to be made. At this point, the recommended actions, I believe it's on page 2, you have the outline of what was presented, and that we are accepting the recommended actions to adopt the governor's budget for the 8 million in deferred maintenance and the 1.18 for the design of the Learning Commons renovation. In addition, and the buildings here certainly have had years of neglect. So I can only tell you that the Learning Commons and that addition is going to make a world of difference for the students as well. What you have are other parts in the document that do address the nursing, the wellness and so forth. As well as the facilities building. I do want to thank you though in closing so we can get to questions as well. Your support in approving the use of construction contingency funding. This helped to support the Loop Road, and some of you have been to the college would recognize that currently there is one way into the college and one way out. The Loop Road will now make a difference. It's scheduled for completion in July of 23, which will give us second entrance. So if there are any emergencies on that campus that block anything, you can walk off, but you can't drive off. So we're pleased with that additional funding and pleased that by 2023, we will see a difference. One other point was on the Bard building that we just heard the demolition. It's going out for bid. That was over a $7 million project, which came in a year ago as well with support from many of you in the government. Some of you we've communicated directly. The demolition is scheduled for completion in June of 2024, with the next step will be how the college will reimagine what needs to transpire in that space. So it will be completely demolished. We do accept the recommendations again for the $8 million in deferred maintenance and the 1.2 for design of the Learning Commons. In closing, Chairman Zucker, I thank you, Vice Chairman McCray as well. The committee invite you again to come to the college to see a lot of the improvements that have come about as a result of the support that you have provided. I'll stop there and we are open to any questions and comments.
Senator Rosebeck?
I realized I met with Mr. Thomas there. So now I know the building. So I'm just curious, big picture. So go back before it was abandoned. What was it used for what period of time? That's question number one. And question number two is, so you own the property, I gather?
We do own the property.
Gotcha. And what are the possibilities for what would be done with the property? And I know you haven't made any decisions, but I'm just thinking my head around the big picture, the past, the current, I get going to demolish it. And then the question is future.
Well, if the committee would approve 50 million, we'll put a building back up again. That would be helpful.
That's what the question I'm asking. I mean, you would like to do that? I mean, the intent is to stay there and.
We do intend to stay there. It does belong to the college, so it will be demolished. And right now we're looking at it in the short term for green space, in probably midterm to look at future construction, coming back to the legislature for support in construction to begin to put many of our programs down there. We have two facilities that we're leasing at a high cost. One is Biopark and the other is the building occupied by workforce. Both of those buildings probably in total leases over 2 million in leased dollars. And it would make more sense for us to utilize those dollars to begin to pour that back into the investment of BCCC in the state.
Where are those buildings?
The one is on, was that Pratt?
Lombard.
Lombard, and the other is Biopark is located.
West Baltimore
Street.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Vice Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Dr. McCurdy, I just want to say thank you for your leadership. We know the challenges that BCCC faced prior to you joining. We know about the realignment and the work that you're doing from that standpoint. I look forward to further discussion. I look forward to helping you with things like the deferred maintenance and just excelling your leadership under there, because it's very well needed. I'm just glad that, you know, it's an understatement to say we're not in the paper for this or that, but at the end of the day, you've got us not only at a neutral stage, but actually going in the right direction. So I lift that up and say thank you again.
I do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair. Madam President, thank you and your team. Have a great rest of your day. I don't see any other questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee will now turn our attention to St. Mary's College of Maryland, and we'll call up Miss Kelly Norton. Ms. Norton, you can begin whenever you get situated. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Here we are. Okay, I'm Kelly Norton. I will be presenting the St. Mary's College Capital Improvement Program. St. Mary's College has 3 projects in the 2024 CIP, the Montgomery Hall renovation, the Campus Infrastructure Improvements Program, and the Calvert Hall Interior Improvement Project. The total in the CIP for these projects is $54.6 million in general obligation bonds. Turning to page 3. The Montgomery Hall renovation is an occupied renovation of an academic building. It will address inadequate class lab space, poor building functionality, and an aging building infrastructure. In total, the project is estimated to cost $42.4 million, and the CIP has requested this year $2.6 million in general obligation bonds to support the planning phase of the project. The cost estimate has increased from the 2023's $1.5 million due to an extended schedule and construction inflation. Turning to page 4, we have the Campus Infrastructure Improvements Program. It's an ongoing project that began in fiscal 2016. Since the start of the program, St. Mary's College has funded 24 projects, completing a third of those projects, and another third are over 50% complete. The CIP is requesting $2.1 million in general obligation bonds for fiscal 2024. The funding will be used for the design and construction of the college's North Campus nodal loop improvements. The project was originally scheduled to begin in fiscal 2023, but was deferred due to cost escalation. DLS recommends approving all authorizations and change to prior authorizations. And that concludes my presentation.
Well, thank you very much for that concise analysis. Any questions? I don't see any. Thank you very much. Can we call up the administration? I think we have the Vice President, Mr. Paseka here. Please come up and start whenever you're ready. And we do have your written testimony, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair Zucker. Chair Zucker, Vice Chair McCray, members of the committee. I am Paul Pusiker. I'm the Vice President for Business and Finance and the CFO at St. Mary's College of Maryland. With me today is Chip Jackson, our Government Relations Liaison. President Jordan is unable to attend today and sends her regards. First, just want to thank you all for the continued support of St. Mary's College and the opportunity to be here today. I also want to thank Kelly for an excellent analysis of our capital budget. The college concurs with the analyst's recommendations for the governor's FY24 allowance, which, as Kelly mentioned, includes $2.6 million to begin the design process for the Montgomery Hall renovation and $2.1 for campus infrastructure improvements. The campus infrastructure improvements for next year will fund the North Campus nodal loop modernization process. Chair Zucker, that concludes our testimony. We thank you for your support and stand ready to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. I don't see any questions, so thank you very much. Safe drive back.
Thank you.
And committee, that concludes today's analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're adjourned.